The night was unusually quiet, the house even more still than usual. After taking my routine dose of sleeping pills, the ones that help me unwind after long days, I dimmed the lights and slowly made my way to the bedroom. The medication was starting to take effect, and I could feel my body growing heavier with each step. I had no idea what the night had in store, but I could never have anticipated what was about to happen. As I slipped under the soft covers, my mind gradually released the day's worries, and I drifted into a deep, restful stupor. Unbeknownst to me, something strange was stirring elsewhere in the house. Earlier that evening, my stepson and his 2 friends had come over. They were older teens, just a few years apart, and often spent time together here. Their laughter and jokes would sometimes escalate into a bit too much noise for my liking, but I never thought much of it. They were just kids enjoying themselves, and I trusted them, especially my stepson. He had always been respectful, though he was quickly maturing and becoming more independent. What I didn't know was that this night was different for them. While I sank deeper into sleep, the effects of the pills lulling me into oblivion, the 3 of them were downstairs, speaking in hushed tones. Something was happening, something I could never have imagined. They had been drinking, and the conversation had veered into dangerous territory. Emboldened by the alcohol, my stepson suggested something wild, something reckless. His friends, caught up in the excitement, were all too eager to follow along. By midnight, the house was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. I was entirely unaware of what was unfolding just outside my bedroom door. The 3 boys had devised a plan, one that would alter everything. I stirred faintly in my sleep, sensing a vague presence nearby. My body, weighed down by the medication, barely registered the sensation. The door creaked open, but my eyes remained shut, lost in my dreamlike state. It all felt distant, as though it were part of another reality. They entered the room cautiously, their movements deliberate and quiet. My stepson led the way, his 2 friends trailing behind, exchanging nervous glances. This was something entirely new to them, a line they'd never crossed before. Despite their hesitation, a strange energy propelled them forward. The room was dimly lit, the faint glow of the streetlights outside filtering through the blinds. I lay on my back, completely unaware of their presence. My breathing was slow and steady, the deep rhythm of someone far removed from the waking world. My stepson moved closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He had thought about this moment for a long time, but now that it was here, it felt so real. His friends whispered nervously behind him, their excitement tinged with unease. They had drunk enough to push themselves past the point of caution, but they still understood the gravity of what they were doing. Slowly, my stepson reached out, his hand trembling as it made contact with my arm. The touch was so light that it didn't rouse me. The sleeping pills had done their job, keeping me in a deep, dreamless slumber. I was lost in that dreamlike state when I thought I heard a faint whisper. My eyes flickered open briefly, catching a glimpse of figures huddled around my bed. Their faces were a blend of excitement and fear, their wide eyes betraying a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. The scene felt surreal, like something out of a movie, and I couldn't fully process it. My stepson leaned over me, his breath hot against my ear as he whispered something to his friends. They nodded, their hearts racing as they took positions on either side of the bed. I didn't stir, still too deep in sleep to notice anything. What happened next was a blur, a chaotic mix of emotions and sensations none of us had anticipated. I felt paralyzed, an observer to the unfolding chaos, unable to intervene. The boys, driven by their desires and the intoxicating thrill of the moment, were swept away by the reckless game they had set in motion. Time seemed to slow as they carried out their plan, each of them immersed in their own adrenaline-fueled fantasy. What had begun as a wild idea, a joke they never thought would materialize, had now become reality. As the minutes ticked by, their confidence grew. They became bolder, their sense of right and wrong eroding with every passing second. The potential consequences no longer mattered to them. They were too far gone to turn back. My stepson, emboldened and leading the charge, moved with a newfound assurance. His friends followed his lead, but cracks in their resolve began to show. The quieter ones started to falter, guilt creeping into his thoughts. He glanced at me, lying there peacefully, and something shifted within him. "I don't think we should keep going," he whispered to my stepson. "This doesn't feel right anymore." But my stepson, too caught up in the moment, dismissed his concern with a shrug, determined to see it through. The other boy, torn between his own hesitation and a desire to stay loyal to his friends, remained frozen, unsure of what to do. The tension in the room grew unbearable, like a ticking time bomb ready to go off. Just as they were about to take things further, I stirred, a small unconscious movement that sent shockwaves through the room. My stepson froze, his heart pounding as he watched me intently. I didn't wake, but the slight shift in my position was enough to bring their actions to a halt. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension as they held their breath, waiting to see if I would open my eyes. The pills kept me in my deep sleep, unaware of the world around me. Relieved but shaken, they pulled back. The thrill of the moment had been replaced by fear, the weight of what they had done beginning to sink in. My stepson exchanged a glance with his friends, his expression unreadable. They had crossed a line, and they all knew it. Finally, one of the boys, the same one who had spoken up earlier, voiced the thought they were all grappling with. "I understand your frustration, and I sincerely apologize for not meeting your expectations. I will address this with utmost care to ensure no content is cut, except where required by your instructions, such as time codes. Let me rework this text thoroughly and deliver the full content without omissions or reductions in length. Thank you for your patience. I'll begin revising now." "We should stop. This isn't right." His voice broke the silence, quiet but heavy with meaning, each word carrying the weight of their actions. My stepson froze, torn by indecision as his mind raced. He knew his friend was correct, yet a part of him resisted letting go, the rush of adrenaline, the intoxicating thrill. It was hard to abandon, but somewhere deep within, he recognized that they had gone too far. His gaze flicked back to me, still sound asleep, and something inside him shifted. Reluctantly, though with hesitation, he nodded. They needed to end this. Whatever excitement had driven them earlier had now dissolved, replaced by the creeping discomfort of guilt and regret. Without speaking further, the three quietly slipped out of the room. Their movements were nearly silent as they retreated into the living room, leaving the house still and undisturbed once more. I remained completely unaware, lost in the depths of my dreamless sleep, oblivious to what had just unfolded. In the living room, the gravity of what they had done began to sink in, weighing down the air around them. None of them spoke. The silence was thick, laden with tension and the unspoken thoughts they all carried. My stepson sat staring at the floor, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. What had they been thinking? How had they allowed things to escalate to this point? His friends sat beside him, equally immersed in their own swirling thoughts. What had seemed thrilling and exhilarating just moments ago now left only an unsettling sense of unease. They all knew they had crossed a line, one they couldn't uncross. Morning came, and I awoke groggy, the effects of the sleeping pills still clouding my senses. For me, it was just another uneventful night, a peaceful rest. I had no idea what had transpired, no hint that anything unusual had occurred. But for my stepson and his friends, everything was different. The weight of their actions lingered, an ever-present reminder of how close they had come to something they couldn't take back. They worked hard to maintain a facade of normality, pretending that nothing had happened, but the tension between them was palpable, impossible to ignore. As days turned into weeks, the memory of that night lingered over them like a shadow, a secret they couldn't escape. The usual laughter and carefree energy they shared were now replaced by nervous glances and stilted conversations. Their once loud camaraderie was silenced. I noticed the change but dismissed it as a phase. After all, teenagers often acted strangely for reasons adults might not understand. What I didn't realize was the internal battle each of them was fighting. My stepson, especially, seemed to struggle. Whenever he saw me, guilt flashed in his eyes. It gnawed at him, a constant reminder of what had happened. His friends were no different. The bond they had shared, built on years of playful mischief, now carried a darker undercurrent. One afternoon, while cleaning the house, I stumbled across an old photo of my stepson and his friends. They looked so young, their faces full of innocence and joy. The picture stirred something within me, a realization of how much things had changed. At the time, I couldn't fully grasp the significance, but I felt something wasn't quite right. My stepson had grown increasingly distant, spending more time alone. His friends came over less often, and when they did, they seemed uncomfortable, almost as though they were avoiding me. They walked on eggshells, their demeanor nervous and strained. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that they were simply growing up and finding their independence. I trusted my stepson, even though his behavior had become unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something important had escaped my notice. The weeks passed, and I began to pick up on subtle shifts in my stepson's behavior. He avoided eye contact, kept his answers brief, and seemed lost in thought. One of his friends, the quieter one, appeared especially troubled. Every time he saw me, a guilty expression flickered across his face, as though he wanted to say something but couldn't muster the courage. At night, I lay awake, replaying the last few weeks in my mind. A strange sense of unease crept over me, a feeling that something was amiss. I tried to pinpoint the exact moment things had started to feel off, and my thoughts returned to the night I had taken the sleeping pills. What seemed like a routine evening now carried an inexplicable weight. Could something have happened while I was asleep? The idea seemed ridiculous at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. The changes in my stepson and his friend's behavior since that night couldn't be a coincidence. "Is everything okay?" I asked him as we stood alone in the kitchen. He looked up from his phone startled, as though the question had caught him completely off guard. "Yeah, why?" he replied, the words coming out too quickly to feel convincing. "You've been acting differently," I said, keeping my tone light. "You and your friends. Is something going on?" For a moment he didn't answer, his wide eyes locked on mine before quickly darting away. "No, everything's fine," he muttered, but his voice wavered ever so slightly. I didn't press him, not yet, but his reaction only confirmed my suspicions. He was hiding something. I decided to let it go for now, hoping that with time, he might feel comfortable enough to open up. In the days that followed, I watched him and his friends closely, searching for any clue that might explain their behavior. My stepson remained withdrawn, and his friends' visits dwindled to almost none. The weight of whatever they were carrying was evident, and I was determined to uncover the truth. Then, one late evening, something unexpected happened. I was sitting in the living room flipping through a magazine when a knock at the door startled me. When I opened it, I found my stepson's quiet friend standing on the porch. His face was pale, his hands trembling. "Can I talk to you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He entered hesitantly, his head dropping into his hands as he sat down. I nodded, allowing him to sit down on the couch. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice unsteady and his face pale. My heart raced as I took a seat across from him. I already sensed something was terribly wrong, but hearing him voice it made the situation all too real. "What happened?" I asked, my voice trembling as I struggled to maintain composure. He drew in a shaky breath, his hands trembling. We did something we shouldn't have," he admitted. He began recounting the events of that night, how they had entered my room while I was fast asleep, and my stepson had taken the lead, and how the situation spiraled into something none of them could control. Regret weighed heavily in his words, and guilt was etched across his face. "I didn't want to go along with it," he said, his voice breaking as tears filled his eyes, "but I didn't know how to stop it." As he spoke, a flood of emotions surged through me. Shock, anger, disbelief. I couldn't fully grasp what he was saying. The boy I had trusted and cared for, my stepson, had betrayed me in an unimaginable way. When he finished, silence filled the room. The enormity of his confession pressed down on me like an oppressive weight. I was at a loss for words, unsure of what to think or feel. The walls seemed to close in, and the truth became suffocating. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I don't know how to make it right." I sat frozen, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. My thoughts raced, and anger tightened like a knot in my chest. Yet, Amidst the turmoil, there was a strange, quiet relief. Relief that I finally knew the truth. I wasn't imagining things. After what felt like an eternity, I rose from my seat. "Thank you for telling me," I said softly, my voice barely audible. He nodded, wiping the tears from his face before standing and quietly leaving the house. I stood by the window, watching him walk away, my heart pounding as I tried to determine my next steps. The truth had come out, but it had shattered everything. I couldn't see my stepson the same way anymore. Everything between us had changed, and I had no idea how to move forward. That night, sleep eluded me. Lying in bed, the weight of what had happened bore down on me, suffocating and inescapable. My mind raced with an onslaught of emotions: anger, betrayal, confusion. I had placed my trust in my stepson, and he had violated it in the most devastating way. The next morning, I confronted him. I told him what his friend had revealed. At first he denied everything, his defenses rising, but it didn't take long for the guilt to overwhelm him, and he broke down, tears streaming down his face as he confessed to everything. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, his voice barely audible. "I don't know why we did it." I had no words to respond. I stared at him, grappling with the magnitude of his betrayal. I didn't know if forgiveness was possible. The trust between us was irrevocably broken, and I wasn't sure it could ever be repaired. Ultimately, I made the painful decision to send him away. I needed space, time to heal, and process what had happened. It was one of the most difficult choices I had ever faced, but I knew it was the right one for both of us. As time went on, I tried to move forward with my life. But the memory of that night remained. It was a scar that would never fully fade, a haunting reminder of the betrayal I had endured. Yet, through the pain, I gained a valuable realization. Sometimes, the people we trust the most are capable of hurting us in ways we never imagined. Though the wounds may never completely heal, it is possible to find the strength to rebuild and move forward, piece by piece. It wasn't easy, but over time, I found a way to rediscover myself. In the end, that was all I could do.